Morning over Cape Canaveral begins like a breath you can see. Condensation ghosts from the launch pad rails. Ice glints on metal. Along the gantry, technicians have spent the night assessing frost and flaking it away, and still the air feels brittle. In classrooms across the country, children lean forward because a teacher is inside the shuttle. Christa McAuliffe's presence has turned this countdown into a national field trip. The camera cuts between the vehicle and bright faces in rows of desks. The announcer's cadence is smooth. We have come to accept that cadence, to expect it. Routine is a comforting rhythm, and NASA's shuttles had taught Americans to hear spaceflight as a scheduled program. But listen closer. Under the polished voice runs a different sound, one that was loud in a conference call the night before, and barely audible here. In a teleconference that stretched late into January 27th, engineers from Morton Thiokol faced NASA officials from the Marshall Space Flight Center and the Kennedy launch team. The issue was simple to describe and hard to fit into a schedule. O-rings seal the joints of the solid rocket boosters. When pressure rises, those rings must flex and seat quickly to block the path of hot gases. In cold weather, rubber stiffens. The engineers were worried that at the forecast temperature on the morning of the 28th, the rings would not seat in time. They brought data from earlier flights, showing erosion and soot blow by in the joints, especially at lower temperatures. They recommended not launching below a certain point. A hold would mean a delay. A delay would mean headlines. As the conversation went on, charts were scrutinized, assumptions tested, and the burden of proof subtly shifted from those who wanted to proceed to those who wanted to pause. This is where culture becomes a hinge. Over the years, the shuttle program learned to live with O-ring erosion. When early tests and flights showed the rings were not always pristine, teams logged the damage, measured what had eroded, and wrote rationales for why the next flight was still safe enough. Each safe return, even with scarred rings, seemed like proof of resilience rather than a warning that luck had intervened. The Rogers Commission later pulled this thread and called it what it was: normalization of deviance, the slow recasting of an anomaly as normal because it had not yet bitten hard enough. Tonight, however, the anomaly was not abstract. It had a temperature. Engineers emphasized the cold, the stiff rubber, the slower response. They urged a no-go. Accounts after the accident would report that they vigorously opposed launching, and that the discussion within Thiokol and between Thiokol and Marshall had grown intense. Top NASA officials at levels 1 and 2 would later tell investigators that they did not know on the night of January 27th that this controversy was underway. They added that if they had heard those engineers' views, they would not have given final approval. That gap between urgent dissent near the hardware and assurance at the heights of authority is not a footnote. It is a fault line. The cold morning arrives anyway. Cameras catch ice on the pad. Viewers see it as atmosphere, a dramatic sparkle, not a clue. The countdown passes its holds. The shuttle rises. For a brief climb, the motion is clean. Then, if you know where to look and you freeze the frame, you see it. A flicker at the aft field joint of the right-hand solid rocket booster. It flares into a flame plume, a narrow, bright cut running sideways across the booster's skin. Hot gases have found a path past the O-rings that should have sealed. The field joint was designed to close under pressure, but on this morning the timing was off. The rubber did not flex fast enough in the cold, and the breach opened in a place no breach can be allowed to open. Moments later, structural failure follows. The technical account is stark and unyielding. The shuttle is gone. Debris will be recovered from deep water, then identified and catalogued. The Commission will trace the cause to the right booster's aft field joint. Its report will note both human and technical failures that came together that morning, and that the launch decision suffered from missing information and misread data. This will not lessen the grief, but it will shift attention beyond the joint to how the agency received, reframed, and at times muffled alarms from its own ranks. In the months that follow, the Rogers Commission meets in public. It takes testimony from managers at the Marshall Center and from contractors, and it presses on how risk was measured. Physicist Richard Feynman listens as engineers describe stand failures, cracks in engine turbines, and a dozen serious problems, only half of them fixed. He also hears managers claim a chance of loss as small as 1 in 100,000, a figure he will later call a kind of magical thinking when set against the engineering record. His attention ranges across the shuttle system, yet his logic keeps circling the same syndrome. When an institution chooses numbers that feel right instead of those that fit the evidence, it starts to believe its own stories. Belief is not simple bravado. It is often built from success, piled on success, and success is a dangerous teacher when it comes without full understanding. Each shuttle mission that flew with O-ring erosion and came back without incident nudged the boundary of what felt acceptable. Each anomaly written up and closed with a rationale became a precedent the next team could cite. None of this required bad intent. None of this required bad intent. It only required busy people, tight schedules, and an organization that rewarded the green light more than it rewarded the cold stop. The shuttle's safety program existed, with people assigned to guard the boundary. Yet the Commission will later use a phrase that lingers: the silent safety program. A system present in charts and boxes that had grown quiet when confronting program momentum. Listen again to the teleconference on January 27th. Engineers explained the physics of cold rubber. They pointed to data. When pressed for a specific temperature limit carved from imperfect charts, they could not produce a neat line that answered every counter-question. Under pressure, the center of gravity of the meeting shifted. A recommendation not to launch became a justification to launch, once caveats were interpreted as uncertainty rather than caution. When Thiokol managers called a private caucus, the engineers thought the pause would harden the case for delay. What came back was a reversal in the face of program pressure. The meaning of their own data had been reinterpreted. Why did this happen? That question drives us, and it is larger than one teleconference. Across years, the shuttle program operated within a budget, under political attention, and with a mandate to make spaceflight routine. Routine itself was an objective. Making it routine, however, required making risk look tame, and making risk look tame required an organizational appetite for rationales. Those rationales were often defensible when read in isolation. O-ring erosion could be measured. Blow-by could be modeled. Erosion could be interpreted as within tolerance. The problem is that the tolerance inched forward as the evidence accumulated. Data that once halted operations later counted as acceptable noise, not because the physics had changed, but because the story told about the data had. On the pad that morning, ice took the stage as theater. In meeting rooms, it showed up as numbers. The shuttle's boosters had not been certified to launch at such low temperatures. That gap between certified conditions and actual conditions required a conscious waiver, an acknowledgement that we would fly outside the boundary because we believed we understood enough. When organizations take that step often enough, the act itself starts to feel like a process rather than a risk. It becomes normalized. Deviance from the original standard becomes the new standard. The Rogers Commission will document the process failures. It will note who said what, who was not informed, and who assumed that the system would step in if the risk was truly unacceptable. It will also look beyond that narrow path to other contributing causes, including a safety program that had lost its independent bite, communication structures that filtered dissent, and institutional incentives that lifted schedule and image alongside safety, blurring priorities. This is not a condemnation of individuals as villains. It is a study of how systems can run on confident habit until that habit blinds them. It is tempting to think that if a few managers had been a bit braver, or if one chart had been clearer, the countdown would have been waved off and the lesson learned without loss. Perhaps. But the culture that led to flying on that cold morning did not form overnight. It grew across many flights and many memos, in debriefs where erosion was logged, catalogued, and rationalized. It was reinforced by public expectations and by political support tied to proving the shuttle could be a reliable machine. It was carried by bright, dedicated people who tried to make something extraordinary into something dependable, and who believed in their mission. We return to the image that endures. A bright plume lancing from the booster's side. It is both a physical fact and a symbol. Physically, it marks the spot where hot gases escaped along a path the O-rings failed to seal in time. Symbolically, it marks the moment when the agency's defenses against its own optimism did not hold. That will be our lens as we move forward. Not to restage tragedy for its own sake, but to understand normalization of deviance the only way we can, by seeing how good intentions, real constraints, and structural habits work together to teach the wrong lessons. In the next steps of this investigation, we will stay close to that teaching process. We will look closely at the early O-ring anomalies, how each was framed, and how those frames trained the decision-makers who later sat in rooms with colder air in the forecast. We will sit with the Commission's phrase, the silent safety program, and ask how a watchdog learns to nap. We will revisit the meeting the night before launch, not to assign blame, but to hear the subtle turn of logic that remade red into amber. We will follow the path up the chain to see how those at levels 1 and 2 did not hear the controversy below, and we will ask why a system built for redundancy did not have redundant channels for dissent. For now, hold on to the contradiction we began with. A nation watched because of a teacher. A teacher flew because the shuttle promised routine. Routine met anomaly on a morning that was too cold. The hardware failed as engineers had warned it might. The institution failed the slow way, through choices that felt reasonable then, and risky only in hindsight. That is the story we are here to tell, step by step, with respect for those who built and those who flew, and with clarity about the patterns that made disaster thinkable. We will not rush to conclusions. We will build our understanding the way a launch should be built, checklist by checklist, stop by stop, listening for the voice that says not today, and asking why that voice was so hard to hear. Step inside the architecture of decision that January, and the room feels crowded, even when only a few voices speak. Not crowded by bodies, but by expectations. NASA carried the weight of a post-Apollo identity, a promise that the space shuttle would be less an experiment and more an airline, a reusable system that would turn the rarefied frontier of space into a dependable route. That image was not pride alone. That image was not pride alone. It was a shield against budget cuts, an answer to skeptical committees, a way to keep engineers employed and launch pads alive. Over time, the image hardened into an internal target. Routines were built around it, and layers of management were asked, with a straight face, to make it real. From Washington came numbers, charts, and a sense of urgency. NASA told Congress and the country that frequent launches would drive down costs and satisfy commercial and military demand. At one point, plans spoke of an incredible cadence, proposing 714 flights between the late 1970s and 1990. The figure lived more as aspiration than schedule. Yet the aspiration bled into planning and became a yardstick for progress. The agency signed payload customers, committed to delivery dates, and stamped launch windows on wall calendars where each shift could see them. If the shuttle was to prove it could be routine, the cadence had to look routine. That logic nested in daily meetings, in risk boards, and in how people interpreted evidence when deadlines loomed. Deadlines changed how the data felt. A graph in a quiet lab reads one way, but it reads differently when a television broadcast is waiting. The Rogers Commission would later say that NASA's managers, buoyed by prior successes and by their own image of the program, sometimes forgot the shuttle was still in a research and development phase. That is the subtle cut where culture does its work. Success trains the eye to see margin where there is only luck, and schedule trains the ear to hear a lack of certainty as no real obstruction. When a small component misbehaves but the mission survives, a sentence forms that sounds reasonable in status meetings. We flew with it before. We flew with it before. Customers added their own gravity. The Department of Defense had high-priority payloads. Commercial satellite companies signed contracts and planned revenues around launch dates. Each delay cascaded into money and reputation. Pressures developed because of the need to meet customer commitments, which translated into requirements to launch a certain number of flights per year and to launch them on time. Those pressures crept toward the console where engineers and managers weighed hardware behavior against calendar behavior. Against calendar behavior. It did not happen in a day, and it rarely appeared as a blunt command. It appeared as a question, asked with a deadline nearby. Is there any data that says we cannot fly? Contractors lived inside the same weather. Morton Thiokol held the contract to design and manufacture the solid rocket motors, including the field joints and O-rings that sealed them. It was a valuable, visible relationship. In such relationships, reputation cuts both ways. A contractor must be seen as vigilant, but also as a partner who solves problems without stopping the machine. Thiokol engineers had flagged joint erosion and blowby in prior flights. They sent memos and presented charts. Yet management layers on both sides filtered those warnings through wider organizational needs. Every contractor knows that the customer can go elsewhere, and every manager knows that a partnership falters if it is defined only by bad news. In that space, doubt is too easy to reshape as debate, and debate is too easy to record as resolved. The Rogers Commission would ultimately assign fault both to Thiokol for a faulty seal design and to NASA for failing to act decisively on known weaknesses. That division did not emerge from an adversarial courtroom posture, but from a portrait of a system that prized schedule and image as much as it prized hardware performance. The Commission also expressed concern that NASA's existing contract incentives did not adequately address safety and quality, with emphasis placed instead on meeting cost and schedule requirements. Incentives do not dictate a person's conscience, but they sketch the horizon line of the possible. If praise and promotion align with keeping the line moving, then arguments for caution must climb a steeper hill. Inside NASA, the official safety architecture looked strong on paper. Program safety offices, reliability engineers, and quality assurance teams existed at every center. There were checklists and independent reviews, documentation trees, and hazard analyses. Yet, the Commission later heard a striking critique. Safety had become a silent safety program. It was present, but not persuasive. It did not possess the direct reporting lines or the independent authority to halt operations. In practice, safety functions were embedded in the same chains that bore schedule responsibility. When the same manager is charged with both moving fast and calling stop, the voice of caution can sound like self-reproach, and it grows quiet. Communication did not help. There was too much of it. The Commission found that NASA's internal system disseminated so much information, with so little discrimination about what mattered most, that recipients had difficulty separating the wheat from the chaff. Memos multiplied. Telecons bred action items. Charts appeared by the dozen. Charts appeared by the dozen. It all looked like competence, and much of it was, but the signal-to-noise ratio punished urgency unless urgency had a date on it. Dissent was not banned. It was buried. By the time it reached senior ears, it often arrived softened, contextualized, or bracketed with countervailing reassurances. Layers mattered. Concern might begin with an engineer on a shop floor or in a thermal lab. It would move to a subsystem manager, then to a project office at a center like Marshall. From there it would cross to a contractor counterpart and rise again to a program manager, coordinating with Johnson and Kennedy. At every handoff someone had to translate. Each translation carried the translator's burdens. What slipped away was not data, but the texture of doubt. Doubt is hard to send upward because it is rarely a single number. It is the feel of a trend line flattening, the way soot patterns spread in a photograph, the cold that lingers in a Florida wind even after the thermometer creeps up. That kind of doubt is easy to shave thin to fit a chart that asks for a conclusion. Listen to a single sentence from the eve of launch, and the structure behind it becomes clear. When Thiokol engineers objected, Marshall's solid rocket booster project manager, Lawrence Malloy, answered with a line that matched the pressure in the room. "My God, Thiokol. When do you want me to launch? Next April." It was not mere impatience. It was an admission that schedule, once sold as a virtue, had hardened into a mandate. External pressures had become organizational goals, and those goals were now aimed not at a building or a policy, but at a person making a call on a cold night. To understand why that call landed the way it did, trace the drift in how NASA framed risk. Early in the program, design limits were understood as guardrails, field joint temperatures, O-ring compression, grease properties, and blow-by tolerances were modeled with margins meant to be respected. Then the shuttle flew, and anomalies appeared. Black soot passed the primary O-ring. Erosion marks that should have stayed theoretical. Each time, the mission succeeded, which made the anomaly look less like a threat and more like an imperfection. Margins, once inviolable, were recast as guidelines, and guidelines could be stretched in the service of a flight that had to go. This is the dangerous learning that organizations perform without anyone writing it down. If the system continues to succeed after an anomaly, leaders infer safety from survival, not from the original margins. What begins as a waiver, granted with grim specificity, becomes precedent. Then precedent matures into policy. No manager would sign a document that says erosion is safe, but many will attend a meeting where erosion is described as understood, bounded, and therefore acceptable for this flight. The next meeting starts from that last sentence and moves forward. Meanwhile, the public face of the program amplified the incentive to press on. The Teacher in Space mission promised a human story that cameras could love. The White House was ready to mention the shuttle in the State of the Union address. None of that inserted an order into a console loop. It did not need to. Visibility alters the environment. Managers knew that millions of eyes would be on the launch, that a scrub would be televised disappointment, and that success would be a national moment of pride. The media did not tighten bolts or read O-ring cross-sections. It raised the temperature in rooms where schedule and confidence are always trying to trade places. Confidence, once elevated, tends to stay aloft until something forces it down. The Commission found human as well as technical failings on the morning of the accident, and it took pains to say that its report had the advantage of hindsight. Inside those rooms, people had to make calls with partial information, in a system that encouraged optimistic readings when pessimistic ones threatened plan. The decision to launch suffered equally from a lack of information and the misinterpretation of the information that did exist. That pairing is revealing. It suggests that even where data were present, the structure around the data shaped their meaning. Consider the O-rings in that light. Thiokol and NASA had flown with primary O-ring erosion before. They had observed blow-by and had recorded it. Engineers warned that low temperature hardened the rubber, delayed seal seating, and allowed hot gases to escape. But the fleet had returned safely each time, and post-flight analysis offered stories that made the next time feel tractable. A change in grease. A tweak in tolerances. a tweak in tolerances, a plan for a redesign on a not-too-distant horizon. In effect, the organization was training itself through exposure. Each exposure that did not kill the mission became a data point in favor of tolerance, even as it should have been a fresh alarm. It is tempting to blame that on willful blindness. The truth is more ordinary and more troubling. Most people in the chain were well-meaning professionals. They worked long shifts, balanced real trade-offs, and felt deep loyalty to missions they believed mattered. Under time pressure, cognitive load makes us reach for patterns we can trust. In an organization devoted to commando solutions, the pattern that wins most often is, "We have seen this and handled it." That sentence is comforting. It is also corrosive when the underlying phenomenon is cumulative, and the boundary conditions, like cold, are shifting in the wrong direction. Behind the scenes, the structure that should have checked that drift was not as sharp as it looked. The Commission's oversight panels worried that NASA did not fully understand why deficiencies in solid rocket motor testing and certification went undetected, despite comprehensive processes. That is a sober way of saying the checks and balances felt procedural rather than protective. If you run a process perfectly, but feed it reframed assumptions, it produces clean paperwork and a brittle result. Quality assurance measured whether steps were followed. It had fewer tools to resist the resizing of risk that occurred upstream in how evidence was narrated. Even as concerns about the current boosters mounted, NASA was considering new hardware, like filament-wound case solid rocket boosters, for heavier payloads. The Commission flagged safety concerns there as well, and even recommended shifting the heaviest payloads to expendable launch vehicles instead. That recommendation, while technical, reveals a cultural undercurrent. Ambition continued to multiply, often faster than the organization could absorb lessons from the parts already in service. The program was stretching, adding load above, while hairline cracks were still forming below. The way information moved during this era hardened these tendencies. A single anomaly might generate dozens of pages, handled by multiple centers and contractors. In meetings, managers sought distilled conclusions, not nested caveats. When they asked, "Is there a constraint to flight?" they wanted a yes or no, followed by a plan. Plan culture rewarded the person who could outline steps and endpoints. The hazard culture, by contrast, must sometimes say, "There is no plan that makes this acceptable tonight," without an independent, empowered safety line to hold that stance. The plan voice won more often than it should have. On the launch preparation timeline, scrubs were normal. Weather moves, hydrogen leaks, range conflicts arise. But scrubs, if too frequent, feed a different story, one in which the machine looks temperamental rather than routine. That story was dangerous for a program sold as airline-like. Each canceled attempt did not just set operations back a day. It chipped at the narrative. Restoring the narrative becomes a goal all its own. In that climate, erosion that once read as a stoplight started to look like a speed bump. The night before Challenger launched, the air was cold enough to make breath visible. Across the teleconference lines, people tried to map that cold onto numbers that lived in their charts. The formal decision language was about qualification and certification. The lived language of that night was about precedent and plausibility. Engineers at Thiokol argued explicitly that the cold pushed the joints into territory they did not understand. Managers asked for proof that cold would cause failure, rather than accepting the earlier, stricter frame which required proof that the environment was within known safe bounds. It is a subtle reversal with enormous consequences. In a healthy system, extraordinary claims, like flying in abnormally cold conditions, need extraordinary justification. Under pressure, the burden of proof slid toward the cautious, who now had to prove danger, not simply point to the absence of safety. We also need to see the interplay of identity and humility. NASA had become a symbol of national capability. Symbols are hard to doubt from within. You do not want to be the first person in the room to say the symbol is brittle. That social weight falls heaviest on the people who control the schedule. They are the visible face of Kando. When they ask hard questions, they also inherit the accountability for delays. It is safer, psychologically and professionally, to accept a bounded risk classification supported by previous flights than to declare those bounds invalid in the 11th hour. This environment did not eliminate dissent. It reshaped its expression. People learned which phrases worked. They learned to frame objections as requests for additional monitoring rather than as stop signs. The outcome was a posture of watchful continuation. Fly and look for this signature. Fly and add an extra camera. Fly and be ready to abort if a parameter wanders. That posture can be prudent when margins are strong. When margins are eroding, it becomes theater, a way to feel vigilant while proceeding as planned. The Commission's judgment about information flow offers a final lens on this period. The system distributed a flood of content, but not a hierarchy of concern. If everything is important, nothing is urgent. In the months and years preceding Challenger, auguring erosion moved from surprise to known issue to managed item. Each stage reduced organizational alarm, while the physical phenomenon remained the same. The anomaly had not changed. The story around it had. What made that story resilient was not malice, but mutual reinforcement. Schedule commitments created pressure. Pressure rewarded optimistic interpretations. Optimism fed the image of routine flight. The image in turn drew more customers and political support, which reinforced the schedule. The loop tightened whenever the shuttle flew successfully, despite warning signs. Every anomaly survived was another stitch in a fabric that could no longer carry the weight placed on it. This is the blueprint of pressure. It is not a smoking gun. It is a floor plan in which rooms meant to be separate. Engineering judgment, safety oversight, schedule performance, and public relations open to one another without doors. When a cold front blows through one room, it chills the whole house. For the people inside, the rooms feel normal because they live there every day. The hazard is only obvious when you step outside and see how the walls align. We will step outside again, not to moralize, but to recognize the mechanics of normalization before we watch them operate in the narrow corridor of a single night. The next calls made under fluorescent lights and against a hard clock will not make sense without the map we have just drawn. Across that map, a quiet lesson has been hiding. An organization can be smart, experienced, and dedicated, and still train itself to miss the one thing it cannot afford to ignore. The auguries had been speaking for years. The system had learned to hear them as a familiar ache. As the countdown approached, other forces still swirled. From publicity plans to the optimism that always gathers around a launch day. None of those forces replaces the simple duty to respect the hardware. Yet duty must be expressed through process, and process, in this case, was shaped by incentives that pushed hard against prudence. Independent safety lacked teeth. Communication blurred urgency. Contract structures dulled the sharp edge of caution. And most of all, repeated survival was mistaken for proof of safety. In a few minutes of narrative time, we will sit in on a teleconference where phrases like launch commit criteria and ICE team carry far more weight than they seem to. Before we do, hold one sentence in mind, kept in the record because its sharpness cut through the careful tones. My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April? It is not the whole story. It is the sound of a culture reaching a single point where schedule, image, and human hope combine to ask the wrong question. The right question was known from the start. What does the hardware need, and what does the data say we do not understand? On that night, the answers existed, scattered across pages and memories. The voice that could have drawn them together had gone too quiet. In the days ahead, we will follow how that quiet formed, how it held, and how it finally broke. For now, hold the blueprint, and the pressures it contains. The shape of what follows will trace it almost exactly. They did not overlook the anomalies. They catalogued and logged them, then learned to live with them. In the early shuttle years, post-flight inspections found scorched scars on the primary O-rings and traces of hot gas called blow-by. Engineers retrieved booster segments and saw where the black elastomer had charred. They filed problem reports and formed working groups. Each safe return bent the story a little. An erosion measurement slipped into a table. A judgment softened the wording, and the next launch date moved closer. The point of danger stayed theoretical, just beyond the latest data. Even with damaged parts in their hands, survival became the proof that the system could take it, that the joint was strong enough, that the next launch would be like the last, only colder or faster or closer to the line. From the start, the joint depended on a clean seal. The putty packed into the gap was meant to act like a shield, holding back heat long enough for the O-rings to pressurize and seal. Commission reviewers later noted a quieter, stubborn risk that hid inside that design. During pressurization on the pad, a 200 pounds per square inch seating operation could blow a small hole through the putty, a blowhole no one would know about before launch. If a blowhole formed, those O-rings would lose their shield, and the joint would face the flame without that first line of defense. The system that depended on a delayed arrival of heat could, under the wrong pre-launch conditions, deliver heat early to unprotected rubber. It was a simple, almost invisible pathway to failure that never announced itself on the ground. Warnings about temperature threaded through these findings, and not only in hindsight. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor for the solid rocket boosters, had been haunted by cold weather performance for months. Faulty engineering analysis, the commission would later conclude, underpinned the agency's readiness to fly. It was not a missing number, but a misreading of behavior. A habit of assuming that what could seal in the best case would also seal in the worst. Roger Boisjoly, a seal specialist at Thiokol, had studied how the primary and secondary O-rings responded at lower temperatures. His internal memoranda in 1985 voiced an urgent fear that cold could stiffen the rubber, slow its response, and let joint rotation open a path for flame. He argued for a redesign, a change to make sealing less dependent on perfect timing under pressure. Boisjoly's argument was plain. The joint flexed at ignition. As internal pressure rose, the metal rotated slightly, lifting away from the O-rings, then swung back. Under warm conditions, rubber snapped into place early enough to block hot gas, even if the putty had imperfections. Under cold conditions, that same rubber could lag by just long enough to let heat cut a path. A few degrees mattered because the closing window at ignition was counted in fractions of seconds. He drew curves, annotated test results, asked for a flight constraint, and tried to move a redesign forward. Management did not ignore him, but they routed his urgency into studies and schedules. The boosters kept flying, data kept arriving, and each flight that ended safely was used to hold the redesign at bay, allowing an unproven assumption to stiffen into a norm. At Kennedy, Alan MacDonald lived with the weight of this uncertainty. He was Thiokol's solid rocket booster project director on site, responsible for recommending flight worthiness. The recommendation was more than a formality. It was a statement that a piece of hardware, with known and unknown flaws, could survive its narrow window of highest stress. MacDonald tracked the anomaly records, argued for conservative limits, and carried the burden of what might be missed. As the cold front rolled in before Challenger's launch, he faced a decision that hinged on those very limits. He understood the seal problem not as a single number, but as a web of small risks that could tighten together. It made him uneasy to the point of refusal, because a signature detached from the warnings felt like a step towards something he could not undo. The erosion record was not empty. There had been joint erosion and blow-by on earlier flights, especially in cold weather. The coldest previous launch, in the low 50s Fahrenheit, produced severe erosion and soot that tracked past the primary O-ring. The mission landed without incident, and the post-flight review stressed that the secondary O-ring held, and that the erosion had not reached a catastrophic depth. Comfort followed, and with it, a drift in logic. If the worst case so far had not broken the joint, some concluded the joint had more margin than they had believed. The two O-rings became a talisman, treated as if the second ring guaranteed safety, rather than as a last resort in a design that should never need it. The meaning of erosion faded from a red flare to an oddity to be watched. On the day before launch, temperature was not an abstraction. The cold was real on the pad and in the forecast. Ice teams reported conditions that no one could model with confidence. Thiokol engineers had already framed a limit in practical terms. They recommended that the shuttle not fly below the coldest previous launch conditions, because there was no direct data to prove that sealing would occur in colder weather. It is a conservative argument, and, in safety matters, a familiar one. Do not assume safety beyond the proven envelope. In teleconferences that evening, they presented charts in their recommendation. The words were cautious, even formal, but the intent was clear. Below the low 50s, they could not vouch for the seal. They asked to wait for warmer weather, not an indefinite delay, but a small shift that aligned with the risk they saw. What began then was not only a technical debate, but a turn in the burden of proof. NASA managers, under schedule pressure that had seeped into everything, pressed for evidence of harm rather than a demonstration of safety. One manager from the Marshall Space Flight Center reacted with a line that would later echo through every retelling. "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April?" The question cut at the premise of the engineer's caution, implying that cold weather would be a persistent barrier and that any hesitation would cascade into missed goals. It recentered the argument, away from whether sealing would work at those temperatures, and toward the inconvenience of uncertainty. In that shift, normalized deviance took on a voice. It asked to see a failure before acknowledging a risk, and demanded that dissenters prove a negative at night, on the clock. The documents in that meeting did not help. Charts carried scatterplots, tables, and notes that failed, in the Commission's later view, to draw a clear line between erosion severity and temperature. A simple graph, temperature on one axis and O-ring damage on the other, might have anchored the discussion in a visible trend. Instead, ambiguity ruled the visuals. Erosion was described, but the relationship to cold hung between pages. Managers asked for trends and got complexity. In that fog, the slight edge went to those arguing for continuation, because a lack of a clear downward curve could be taken as a lack of definitive harm. It was not a trick. It was how misframed information performs under time pressure. And it let a false comfort grow, because damage without disaster looked like a margin growing, not shrinking. The exchange narrowed to what had already happened and whether it fit within tolerances. Engineers spoke about delayed sealing, about joint rotation, about the possibility that a flame path could establish before either ring sealed. Managers asked if erosion had ever consumed the full thickness of an O-ring. The answer was no, because the worst case had not yet occurred. Did that mean the system had more to give, or that it had come near its unknown edge? No one could say in a way that satisfied the demand for certainty. The lopsided demand took hold. The room did not treat missing proof of failure as an alarm. It treated it as permission. A long evening hardened into a familiar binary. Are you telling us we can never fly in cold weather? Or can we accept that the joint has performed within data so far? Then came a pause, not technical, but managerial. Thiokol's leadership called for a caucus, a private huddle without NASA on the line. As recountings from inside describe it, the debate turned from engineering limits to organizational posture. The phrase "put on your management hats" would be remembered because it named the shift in roles. In that small room, with flight dates and agency pressures weighing on careers, the company revised its stance. After minutes that felt much longer, they returned to the call and changed their recommendation. They would proceed with the launch. The switch did not erase the engineers' concerns. It acknowledged them, and then overrode them, turning a cautious argument into a footnote. The scientific question had been replaced by an operational decision justified with ambiguity rather than with confidence. McDonald did not yield. At the Cape, he had authority over Thiokol's final sign-off, and he refused to put his name on the flight. He believed the risk was not theoretical but present, made worse by the cold that would stiffen rubber and slow the timing of the seal. His manager signed in his place. That night, the project machinery now had a green light from the contractor, and NASA treated the issue as closed. The director of Marshall's shuttle project's office, the commission would later find, may have failed to report the full result of the teleconference up to the associate administrator for spaceflight. The chain went quiet where it needed to carry noise. A flawed analysis of SEAL behavior stood, uncritiqued, by a safety program that should have brought an independent voice. The shuttle now stood as if the question had been answered. For McDonald, nothing felt settled. He knew the list by heart. O-ring erosion logged across missions, blow-by under colder conditions, a joint that relied on timing, a putty shield that could fail without a trace, and rubber colder than on any prior launch. Months earlier, he had argued for a solid redesign, then fought for a simple temporary control. Do not fly below previous cold data. It was simple prudence. The reversal, and how easily the word "flightworthy" returned to paper, hollowed him. He expected to be second-guessed for slowing the schedule, not to see descent squeezed into a box on a telecon chart. As winds rattled the service structure that night, he felt the awful geometry of a known weakness lining up with an avoidable condition. There was also, in the background, a ledger no one would call by name. Contractor relationships were at stake. Thiokol, dependent on NASA's business, could not lightly be the cause of a delay that rippled across military and commercial payloads. The agency had internalized goals that stretched human systems thin. Managers worked under what the commission termed a frenetic pace. That pressure did not issue a direct order to launch. It dissolved the appetite to defend a pause. When Mulloy pressed with his next April line, he stood in a posture the organization had been training for years, that of a problem solver clearing obstacles quickly. The deeper reality that safety calls require patience rather than speed had slipped below the surface. The safety program, weakened over time, did not assert a check on that impulse. The memo trail from prior reviews carried its own blindness. Flight readiness reviews had accepted explanations that should have drawn heavier scrutiny. The belief that putty would shield O-rings until pressure seated them felt sound until blowholes were acknowledged as a possible pre-launch defect. The conviction that a secondary O-ring offered adequate redundancy ignored the physics of blow-by that could cut across both rings if sealing lagged. Problem tracking lacked control, and independent critique was missing when it mattered. The commission's summary would later list these as core weaknesses. In the room, however, they existed only as older conclusions that now read like permission slips. The very formality that was meant to hold the line had become a series of steps people worked around to keep the shuttle flying. Ice complicated everything without taking the stage. The structures around the orbiter held patches and sheets that no one could predict once engines lit. Some argued those hazards were tolerable or could be managed by procedures. Others stressed that the analysis could not promise safe behavior at ignition. The program manager's decision to launch despite that uncertainty, the commission later said, was not prudent. The launch director's evaluation did not place safety first as it should have. Even so, for our story's thread, the critical point is this. The seal problem, the one that lived in the joint and the cold and the small arc of motion at ignition, did not climb any higher that night after the caucus. A technical truth and a structural truth had met, and the structure won. Normalization of deviance often looks like an argument about evidence when it is actually an argument about imagination. In the teleconference, managers asked for a certain kind of data, the kind that could soothe operational anxiety. Engineers offered uncertainty tied to physical behavior and asked for time. The mismatch was fatal in shape long before it was fatal in outcome. The decision proved the rule. In systems where repeated success is used to define normal, any warning without a recent accident feels thin. Charts gain weight if they match the story of continued flight, and they lose force if they threaten it. A single clear plot of temperature against damage might have pierced that story. But it was not on the table that night. The ambiguity kept the room comfortable. Beaujolais left that call with a feeling engineers try to avoid at all costs. The sense that the case had not failed on facts, but because the venue was not built to hear them. He had warned in writing that a catastrophic loss of vehicle and crew could result from the joint condition. He had canvassed colleagues and pushed for a design change. In the last hour before a decision, he spoke as plainly as he could. The recommendation was reversed anyway. Later accounts describe him going home ill, fearful not in the abstract, but for the crew sleeping near the pad. McDonald at the Cape would rise before dawn with the same dread. The pattern had been set, not by a single order, but by hundreds of prior nudges that taught people to read the data in a way that always bent back toward launch. The contradiction at the heart of this night is instructive. The organization had an official posture that safety was paramount, and structures that implied independent oversight, yet the Commission found those structures weak in practice. The Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance Program did not challenge the flawed analysis offered for SEAL behavior. It did not force a clean case up the chain. The director at Marshall may have failed to report the teleconference results to the associate administrator, which meant a key warning never had a chance to trigger higher caution. The whole point of layered review is to allow a dissent to find a hearing at the right height. That path was blocked by culture and practice, by habit and hope. Picture the pad in those hours before sunrise. The fixed service structure carried frost, the air bit at exposed skin, and inside the right booster's aft field joint sat 2 O-rings colder than any that had flown. The findings about putty blowholes and seating overpressure lived in reports, not in the minds of everyone who needed them at that hour. The SEAL logic that assumed warmth sat like a ghost in the joint. The choice had been made in a meeting that most of the launch team never saw, sealed by signatures that were meant to distribute responsibility and too often to hide it. It is tempting to look back and say the outcome now seems obvious, but what mattered then was the lived process by which normal bent to include greater risk without ever naming it as such. There is a particular kind of silence that follows such a meeting. It is not agreement. It is compliance built on ambiguity. Engineers who had spoken against the launch now had bosses who had cleared it. Managers who had asked sharp questions now held a paper that said flight-worthy. The language of safety turned polite, careful not to reopen the argument. When people ask later why no one stopped the count, the truer question is why, after the recommendation flipped, there was no safe place left to carry a final appeal. The meeting had crystallized years of drift into a single yes. Once that yes existed, it spread through the system with the force of a new fact. The shuttle was launching. Every other decision turned to support that. And so a record of small scars became the case for routine. A prediction of hazard turned into a lack of proof. A contractor's fear of losing standing pulled a hinge in the opposite direction of courage. An internal safety net sagged where it had to be taut. The last conservative brake, a no-go at low temperatures, was pressed and then released in 1 hour. The human story is not that people intended to harm, but that a language of success trained them to overlook harm's approach. When the sun rose, the joint would face its test, not in a lab or a room full of charts, but in a white roar over the Atlantic marsh. Before we return to that morning, we need to understand one more thing. This system did not only fail in a night call, it failed in how it taught itself to see. That lesson, too, has a record. The point of tracing these choices is not blame but mechanics. The data existed, scattered and underemphasized, to justify a pause. The structures existed, in name if not in force, to demand a higher review. The personalities, from Boisjoli to MacDonald to Mulloy, played their roles inside a design that rewarded momentum. We watch the teleconference because it shows a principle we will need to recognize elsewhere. When pressed, the burden of proof moved to the side that asked for caution, and the documentation that could have supported them was not framed to carry weight. The result felt like a debate lost on style, but it was actually the culmination of a strategic error. The shuttle program had been measuring success by flights flown, and that measure was about to erase the most important counterfactual, the one flight that must not go. We stay with that night because it holds the hinge. Dawn at Kennedy came sharp and brittle, the kind of cold that makes metal ring when you tap it. Frost had crept along the railings. Ice had formed on the service structure, and the orange foam of the external tank glittered under floodlights where rime clung to its curve. Overnight lows had dipped below freezing, colder than any previous shuttle launch morning. An ice team walked the pad before sunrise, clipboards and cameras in their gloved hands, stepping around glistening puddles that were frozen hard. Heaters could not change what the night had already set. Hydrogen lines contracted, seals stiffened, and the massive boosters loomed silent, their joints as cold as the air around them. The schedule, after weeks of delay, pressed down, steady and implacable. This was not just another launch. Weather and technical snags had already pushed the schedule. A high school teacher was on board, and the president planned to include the moment in the State of the Union, a nod to ordinary citizens reaching space. A satellite customer watched the clock. The Department of Defense watched the manifest. The country watched a promise of routine access to orbit. Managers knew the backstory was messier, yet the program's public face leaned on reliability. All the prior flights, all the scrubs and resets, would mean little if the day stalled again on the pad. The cameras were already rolling. Engineers walked their ice surveys twice that morning. They logged heavy accumulations near the fixed service structure, long fingers of ice on handrails, and patches along the intertank region. On paper, the concern centered on falling ice, on chunks that might shear off at liftoff and shatter thermal protection tiles, or puncture a control surface. That was a quantifiable hazard with a checklist mitigation plan. Discussions tilted there toward pad heaters, camera coverage, and revised inspection intervals. The solid rocket booster joints, buried under insulation, did not glint or drip. They offered no photographic drama. The risk that cold crept into the rubber and slowed the seals lived in some minds and lay buried in others, hidden by the ice you could see and the schedule you could feel. By mid-morning, the countdown had marched back to synchronized rhythm. Weather was within bounds. Winds were far from perfect but acceptable. Managers gathered in firing rooms and conference loops, their procedures honed by habit. A series of go polls came back crisp. The voice cadence on the net had that calm, that sounds like confidence even when it is only procedure. What had flickered through the teleconference the previous night, the hesitations and caveats around temperature, seemed to have been filed in the slot labeled known but acceptable. The booster joint would do what it had done before, or so everyone let themselves believe. At T-6 seconds, the main engines lit in a timed cascade. their exhaust pouring into the trench and rolling out as white steam. The boosters fired at 0, a brilliant flare that washed the pad in violent light. In the first heartbeat after ignition, small puffs of dark smoke slipped from the right-hand solid rocket's aft field joint, a hint caught by high-speed cameras but unseen by anyone in real time. Rubber chilled overnight did not spring back at the speed the design expected. The primary O-ring did not seat fully against the gap, and hot gases slipped past, charring the seal and spitting soot. The second O-ring, meant as a backup, sat in the same cold steel and under the same physics. For a few seconds, what had failed tried to forgive itself. The internal combustion of the booster baked aluminum oxide into a brittle glaze that bridged the leak like a scab. Pressure loads squeezed the joint toward closed, not quite tight, but tight enough for the moment. The plume of smoke ceased. Telemetry and boosters climbed together, the vehicle rolling onto its ascent profile. The ocean falling away under a winter sky. The temporary seal, invisible to the flight directors and the crew, was all that kept Flame from wandering where it did not belong. The call came through the loop at 30 seconds for throttle reduction to guard the structure at max Q, the point of highest dynamic pressure. Engines eased back, then built up again. The sky was clear but the air was rough, and the stack flew into winds it had not yet met at that temperature. At 59 seconds, cameras caught a flicker on the right booster. Then a hard line of flame shot sideways from the aft field joint. The oxide plug had eroded or been pried loose by joint flexing under load, and now a steady jet of hot exhaust carved into the gap. The flame struck the external tank's aft brace and licked the skin of the liquid hydrogen tank, a silver membrane that was never meant to feel heat. Inside the orange foam, cryogenic propellant sloshed and boiled, pressure rising in a place that had no tolerance for fire. The flame burned through a strut that tied the booster to the tank, lifting the right-hand rocket a fraction against its mounts. The liquid hydrogen tank's wall weakened and ruptured, releasing a cold tornado of fuel. A fraction of a second later, structural loads on the intertank surged past design. The liquid oxygen tank at the top failed. In 73 seconds, the aerodynamics tore the vehicle apart. White vapor spread like a sea flower against the blue. The solid rockets, still thrusting, speared ahead as if nothing had happened. The crew cabin broke free and arced forward, still pressurized. On the ground, the launch commentator's practiced voice faltered only once. "Obviously a major malfunction," he said, because there was no approved phrase for what everyone could see. Across the country, classrooms went still. Teachers put hands to their mouths. Children stared at a sky they could not feel. The idea of routine had met the sight of catastrophe, and the mismatch was too large to parse. Television anchors looked for words that would not inflame, that would not accuse, that would also not deny what was plain. In Houston, the flight controllers scanned tiles of data, looking for a strand of normal they could cling to. There was none. The mission that had been designed to bring space closer to ordinary life was now lived in every living room as a tragedy. It was not just a launch failure anymore. It was a national moment. Range safety sent destruct commands to the two solids to end their wild climb. Fragments drifted amid the white smoke and sparkling foam. Helicopters lifted off from the Cape and Coast Guard cutters headed out. Debris maps formed in pencil on plastic overlays, then in ink. In the confusion of the first minutes and hours, rumor traveled as fast as fact. Parachutes might have been spotted. The booster had veered. The external tank had exploded spontaneously. Real answers would need camera frames and metal. None of that would arrive before the microphones stood up. By the afternoon, NASA held a press conference. The tone was measured, somber, constrained. Officials expressed shock and sympathy, resisted speculation, and promised an investigation. They noted how many cameras had recorded the launch, how much telemetry had been sent, how many data products would need to be recovered and reconciled. They did not say the word O-ring. They did not have to. The earlier public record included concerns about solid rocket seals in cold weather, and the cold was on every screen. Reporters asked about temperature, and managers answered with care, as if phrases themselves could tilt the meaning of the day. In the background, photo interpreters worked at speed. At a viewing site, someone had captured a telephoto image that showed a tongue of flame licking the side of the right-hand booster, well before the white bloom at 73 seconds. With each pass through the film, each contrast boost and crop, attention tightened on the joint. Within days, those first images were circulating among engineers and in newsrooms. Another thread moved with them. Ignition footage that showed early puffs of smoke at the same joint. A steady and damning match. If a seal had failed to seal, then the cold had to be in the frame of the story. Leaks and whispers sharpened the picture. The New York Times and other outlets reported that engineers had urged a delay because of the cold, and had been overruled. Names began to appear in print, then on camera, from people who had been on the evening call where data met hope. A manager's line cut through the noise and stayed in memory. "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April?" Whether said in frustration or as strategy, it sounded like pressure made plain. The public story, so recently built on routine, now tilted toward the warnings and how they were handled. At the White House, the need for clarity and calm pushed the process forward. The president announced an independent investigation, the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, chaired by William Rogers, a former Secretary of State and Attorney General. Its task was to find the cause and recommend fixes, to learn without dismantling a national project. The members carried both technical weight and public trust. There was Neil Armstrong, whose authority came from flying through risk and past failure, and Sally Ride, incisive and grounded. There was Richard Feynman, a physicist with little patience for equivocation, and Air Force General Donald Kutina, who brought launch experience. There were also aeronautics scholars like Eugene Covert. The commission would work in the open when it could, and behind closed doors when it had to. It would ask about metal, and it would ask about people. Early hearings established the visible facts with stark efficiency. The right solid rocket booster had lost its seal at the aft field joint. A flame plume had emerged late in ascent and impinged on the external tank. Structural breakup had followed at 73 seconds. No one disputed the images on the screen. Yet to settle those points was not to settle accountability, and the commissioners pressed on process. Why fly that morning if the cold made the seal uncertain? How had concerns been framed the night before? Uncertainties been framed the night before. What was the chain that turned doubts into consent? Feynman kept returning to temperature. Wright asked for the memos. Armstrong, even in understatement, signaled that the program owed more than words. The commission soon widened its scope. It subpoenaed test histories and design reviews from Morton Thiokol and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where the booster program lived. It found that the joint's design, with tang and clevis and two O-rings separated by putty, had a long record of erosion and blow-by in tests and flights, more often than public briefings suggested. It found that the seals had been tagged as Criticality 1 features in 1982, meaning their failure could destroy the vehicle. It found written objections to the design dating back to the late 1970s. And it found that neither Thiokol nor NASA had reached a verified redesign in time, even as data stacked up that the original concept was marginal. The final report would put it plainly. The genesis lay in the joint's faulty seal design, and in the failure by both organizations to understand and respond to facts from testing. Meanwhile, the public kept listening for a single sentence that could resolve the shock. Some reporters framed it as a story of a bad part at the wrong temperature. Others stressed management choices, a culture that had treated anomalies as experience instead of warnings. NASA spokespeople kept their language careful, neither scapegoating the contractor, nor indicting their own people in the press. Families of the crew moved from private grief to public memorials, and the nation's appetite for answers grew with every vigil and every clip of the teacher's smile from training. Two narratives gathered mass, each incomplete alone. The first was mechanical and soothing in its clarity. A seal failed in the cold. The second was systemic and harder to hold, because it pointed to decisions, incentives, and the slow drift of standards. If you listened closely in those weeks, you could already hear the culture critique beginning to form. Safety offices existed at centers and at headquarters, but they had not altered the path to the pad. The commission would later title a chapter, "The Silent Safety Program," and the phrase fit the impression of the early testimony. Warnings had been delivered, yes, but not in a way that the system could not ignore. The burden had often fallen on engineers to prove harm, rather than on managers to prove safety. When a critical feature eroded and nothing catastrophic followed, people learned a destructive lesson. Survivals were treated like validation. The cold morning did not create that habit. It revealed it. Back at the Cape and along the Florida coast, the physical search deepened the story. Barges and boats lifted panels, tiles, wiring looms, and twisted metal from the Atlantic. The pattern on recovered booster segments traced the path of heat downward from the joint. The field joint surfaces on the right-hand rocket held deposits and discoloration that matched the photo plume. And the smoke at ignition. Telemetry, cross-referenced with film, synchronized the moment when the leak began anew with the timing of the aerodynamic loads. Nothing in the main engines or avionics showed a primary fault. Attention kept circling back to the ring of rubber that had not done its job, and to the morning that had made that failure more likely. Inside the commission, cross-currents built. Some members wanted to stick to the physics and the metallurgy, to draw clean lines from cause to fix. Others argued you could not draw a complete line without mapping the organization that chose to accept eroding margin. Feynman, in one of the hearings that would become iconic, pressed a piece of O-ring rubber into a glass of ice water with a clamp, then let it go. It stayed flattened for a telling moment before it flexed back, a small demonstration that spoke to the way cold alters recovery and sealing. His simple show, done in public, cut through hedged phrasing. The thing was stiff in the cold. Everyone could see it. When the commission staff pulled telephone logs and presentation charts from the launch eve teleconference, more texture appeared. Charts had not drawn direct lines between low temperature and degree of damage in a way that a manager could not argue with. The framing had been defensive. The language around hard boundaries was soft. The meeting had split into technical assessment and managerial caucus, and the decision had shifted in that gap. External pressures, internalized as schedules and promises, had moved through the chain until the burden of proof had been reversed. The phrase "proceed unless proven unsafe" had not been written as a rule, but by then it did not need to be. By the time the commission reached its open sessions in Washington, the technical cause was no longer in dispute. The aft field joint on the right solid rocket booster did not seal at liftoff, briefly sealed again in flight, then opened under load. Hot gases escaped. Flame struck the external tank and the strut, and the vehicle broke apart at 73 seconds. The commission would state plainly that the contractor was responsible for the flawed joint design, and it faulted NASA for failing to act on repeated warnings and for not insisting on a verified redesign. The story of the plume was clear. The story of why that plume was ever possible took longer to tell. In homes and classrooms the conversation shifted. People asked not only what failed, but how a system that had worked so hard to prevent failure could be blind on the morning that mattered most. The Teacher in Space program, once a spark for inspiration, now stood as a reminder of the human stakes when an organization convinces itself that the next launch must go. The memory of that bright winter plume burned into the public mind, not only as an image of hardware coming apart, but as a sign of a culture that mistook past flights for proof that it was safe to fly. The Commission would have to answer the technical questions to repair the vehicle. It would also have to answer the cultural questions to repair trust. By the close of those first weeks, as recovery went on and hearings gained pace, a shift had settled in. The mechanical cause was clear and named. The images were now part of the record. Draft language for the report had taken shape, noting faulty design and a failure to act on test data. Yet the most important question hung in the air, cold and insistent. If the joint's weakness and its sensitivity to temperature were known, if the O-rings had been marked as critical years earlier, why did an organization of intelligent, dedicated people press on into that wind? That is where the story turns next. The hearing room was bright with cameras and patient with silence, the kind of quiet that settles when people agree. They are not only looking for a cause, but for a reason. William Rogers presided with a lawyer's poise. Beside him sat a Nobel laureate who did not care for ceremony. Richard Feynman kept a yellow pad near his elbow and a stubborn curiosity in his voice. The nation had already seen smoke, flame, and falling wreckage. It wanted a mechanical answer. Feynman wanted the deeper one, the path by which an organization had learned to call a warning sign normal. He began where engineers worked, on shop floors and in windowless rooms where testing left grit on your hands. At Marshall and at Thiokol, he asked blunt questions. When people hesitated, he asked them again, a little simpler and a little sharper. He traced the history of the solid rocket booster joint, noting how it flexed under pressure and how hot gases could slip past the primary O-ring before it sealed. In the cold, the elastomer grew sluggish and unforgiving. He asked for data on launches, on cold days, and on the pace of seal erosion. He studied the pre-launch teleconference, the push and pull between go and no-go. Then he asked for a piece of O-ring. The moment is etched into the public memory, because it translated a field of specialized knowledge into something a person in the back row could feel. During a televised session, Feynman took a small length of O-ring, clamped it in a C-clamp, and plunged it into a glass of ice water on the table. He waited, not long, then removed it, and loosened the clamp. The rubber did not spring back with eager resilience. It stayed flattened and sullen before slowly regaining its shape. He did not raise his voice. He let the material speak. Cold could stiffen the seal. Cold could turn a margin into a void. In a few minutes, a sentence from materials science had become a sensation in the gut. When he later wrote his appendix to the report, he pressed the point home. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, because nature cannot be fooled. The commission did not stop at the joint, and this is where the story shifts from a single part to a whole system. The chapters on other contributing causes made a careful inventory of how the abnormal became familiar. The record showed a string of O-ring erosions and blow-by across missions, each swallowed by a decision process that treated them as acceptable and unavoidable while the fix moved slowly. Problems were worked without stopping flights. Technical concerns about cold weather lived in memos and hallway conversations, but many never rose into the categories that would have forced a program-level decision. The organization had developed a habit, and the habit wore the costume of reason. The Rogers Commission gave that habit a name within NASA's structure. In a chapter titled The Silent Safety Program, it concluded that the safety, reliability, and quality assurance workforce had been reduced. That cutback blunted the checks that once saved lives. During Apollo, redundant safety functions caught danger before it matured. By the mid-80s, the process had dulled. The report noted that unrelenting pressure to meet an accelerating flight schedule might have been bearable if NASA had insisted on the exacting, thorough procedures that had defined its earlier success. Instead, over time, the safety program lost effectiveness, and the essential checks and balances eroded. The phrase was dry, but the image was not. The net that keeps a tightrope walker alive had frayed, almost imperceptibly, strand by strand. From outside the agency, a former NASA official, the historian Alex Rowland, offered a lens for how these strands unraveled. The shuttle was not just a vehicle. It was the program. There was, he said, no way out. Overwhelming problems were denied, not by villains but by people inside a proud institution who had slowly fooled themselves. They were not lying to the public so much as living inside their own story. That is how normalization works. The odd becomes ordinary, then the ordinary becomes policy, and soon policy has a pedigree that resists doubt. Feynman, who loved a clear experiment, also loved a clear argument, and the commission case finally turned on culture. Consider the symptoms of groupthink that scholars would later circle with a red pencil. There was pressure toward consensus, not in the sense of a shared aim, but in the sense of not spoiling the plan. Dissenters were discounted as outliers, and inconsistent data was rationalized with elaborate explanations that required fragile conditions to hold. On the night before launch, the burden of proof slid almost casually. Instead of asking for proof of safety at the edge of the envelope, key decision-makers asked for proof of danger that would justify a delay. That inversion felt like rigor. It was, in fact, drift. Charts helped that drift along. When Thiokol engineers tried to argue that colder temperatures meant higher risk, the presentation that reached the table did not show a sharp, unmistakable curve from temperature to erosion. It showed cases organized by mission, with notes and qualifiers, stories tucked into small cells. The worst data did not lead. The clearest link was not drawn. A layperson could look and see ambiguity, and in ambiguity a manager might find permission. Layer by layer, the evidence felt less like a siren and more like a puzzle. Feynman, who distrusted puzzles that looked easy to solve, kept asking where the strongest, most frightening fact lived. He wanted it up front, in plain sight. That is how one keeps nature from being fooled. Communication failed with a slow leak rather than a violent rupture. At Marshall, the depth of concern about temperature never traveled all the way to the top in a way that forced a strategic pause. Risk signals were diluted as they rose through managerial layers, rounded off by process, euphemized by habit. In the months before the accident, anomalies were not escalated to the most urgent categories. People worked the problem while flying the fleet, and that institutional posture had a name that carried both realism and resignation. Acceptable. Unavoidable. It is the kind of language that helps a team cope under pressure, and the kind that can hide a cliff. Contractor dynamics shaped the atmosphere in subtler ways. Morton Thiokol was the solid rocket motor supplier, sitting in a sole source position that came with prestige and peril. Saying no to a launch risked looking obstructionist to a powerful customer. Saying yes aligned with a decade of promises about shuttle reliability and cadence. When the launch GE teleconference turned cold, a management caucus at Thiokol asked engineers to put on their managerial hats. The reversal that followed did not nullify technical arguments. It changed the frame of proof. The customer heard what it wanted to hear, and a remark from a Marshall manager, Lawrence Malloy, exposed the pulse behind the mask of procedure. On hearing resistance, he quipped, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April?" In that line, external pressure became an internal goal, dressed as a timeline, then enforced by momentum. Inside NASA, structural strains made that momentum feel rational. The shuttle had been sold as a truck for space, a frequent flyer moving satellites, and people with airline-like regularity. There were military payloads waiting, commercial schedules inked, a teacher in space mission promised to classrooms. The high utilization model turned every delay into a cascade. In such a climate, Canado culture, the hallmark of Apollo, could mutate into must-do habit. Success became a reassurance that drowned out the memory of risk. A program that had once defined itself by caution learned to define itself by calendar justice. As Feynman moved through the inquiry, he saw a tension that cast a long shadow. When he asked engineers for honest failure probabilities, the answers were sobering. Often they estimated a catastrophic loss at about 1 in a few hundred flights, and sometimes worse for specific components under stress. Then he compared those figures with the numbers management had used in earlier years to sell the program's reliability, and heard breathtaking optimism. Claims approaching 1 in 100,000. He did not see this as a moral failure, but as a cognitive one. A mismatch between the map and the terrain. In Appendix F, he wrote that charts on panels and confident briefings could not override the simple realities of physics and wear. The point was not that hope is wrong. The point was that hope has no veto over how rubber behaves in the cold. Testimony gave human texture to an abstract pattern. Roger Boisjoli and Alan MacDonald did not arrive as prophets. They came as working people who had tried to raise a hand and slow a train. They described a long list of concerns that never gained a formal veto in the integrated decision chain. Safety existed on paper, yet it lacked the power to stop a mission, unlike the quality program that had halted an Apollo operation. The Commission listened to the engineering voice, then mapped where that voice faded. It followed the charts, the memos, the off-ramps. It recorded how a brave attempt at whistleblowing struggled inside a quiet safety program. Outside the Commission, a congressional committee took up the case and confirmed what the presidential panel had found about NASA's safety, reliability, and quality assurance programs. They were grossly inadequate, the committee said. The committee went further, recommending that NASA define a complete risk management program that treats hazard tracking not as paperwork, but as an operational break. It called for a thorough review of all criticality 1 and 1R items and of hazard analyses to see where single-point failures hid inside the optimistic architecture. It asked for a study on how to give shuttle crews a means of escape during controlled gliding flight. A hard subject that forced the agency to face loss scenarios without euphemism. It urged careful scrutiny and improvement in management structures, safety organizations, communication procedures, and maintenance policies. In some areas, the committee's tone diverged from the Commission, more willing to argue that the underlying problem was deeper than miscommunication. But on the core point, the two investigations aligned. NASA had built a machine that could kill, then built a culture that forgave its warnings. The media turned these findings into pressure the public could feel. Reporters surfaced internal memos about oaring concerns and cold weather, including documents that showed engineers pleading for a delay. The story that reached kitchen tables was not a shock event, but a drip of recognition. People read about managerial layers that softened the hardest sentence, about charts that hid the steepest curve, about a phone call where a firm no turned into a conditional. Yes, that coverage did not need outrage to have force. It needed daylight. Daylight did what it always does. It forced a reckoning with how a nation's happiest dream had been asked to carry too much promise. As the Commission's diagnosis settled in, the phrase normalization of deviance took on a practical meaning. It described a loop. An anomaly occurs. Because it does not immediately cause disaster, it becomes a precedent. Each repetition of that anomaly without catastrophe becomes a justification. The threshold of alarm moves. Language catches up, calling the abnormal acceptable. Metrics adapt. Charts change. Managers learn to hear concern as noise. In that loop, the burden of proof migrates. Skeptics must now prove danger beyond doubt in order to stop the machine, while advocates of action can demand pristine evidence that often does not exist at the margins. In other words, the closer a system gets to the edge of its safe envelope, the more it demands unrealistic certainty from caution and accepts generous uncertainty from momentum. It is an elegant trap. So what did the Commission and the agency prescribe to climb out of that trap? Technically, The solid rocket booster joints would be redesigned with steel capture features, with heaters and with vent paths that kept hot gas from touching the rubber, changes we will soon see take shape. Organizationally, the recommendations reached for structure. Create a strong safety and quality assurance office that reports to the NASA administrator, not one buried inside a program manager's empire. Restore staffing and rebuild the culture of independent review. Tighten the flight readiness review so unresolved anomalies cannot be papered over with conditional language. Make hazard identification continuous, not a one-time certification ritual. Make descent visible in the room with signatures and documented rationale. Ensure that contractors know frank warnings will be protected, not punished, and that performance metrics will not coax silence. Feynman fought for one more prescription that sounded less like a plan and more like an ethic. He had worried that the commission would end with polished prose and ambiguous comfort. He drafted an appendix designed to resist smoothing. It called out the gulf between management perceptions and engineering realities, and it insisted on a principle that feels almost obvious until the day you most need to hear it. The laws of physics are not moved by a launch date. Public relations cannot bend strain and temperature. A subsystem that has crept into the danger zone with quiet anomalies is not persuaded by declarations of excellence. Nature, he wrote, cannot be fooled. Getting that sentence into the official report required a fight. He had to insist that it be printed in full and unedited. In the end, it stood there like a lighthouse, a small column of text that could not be confused for compromise. But principles must travel. They do not work if they live only on a title page or in a senator's summary. The question that hovered, even as the cameras left the hearing room, was whether an institution could relearn how to doubt itself aloud. Inside NASA, there were thoughtful people who believed it could. Many had built careers on caution, and the accident hurt them with a private sting. The safety program would regain people and authority. Reporting lines would be redrawn. The schedule would be treated as a goal rather than a mandate. Flight after flight, the new joint would behave. And yet, as we look back with the advantage of time, we can see the fragility of those promises. Culture is not a checklist. It is what people think is normal on a hard day. Groupthink did not vanish with a new chart template. Pressure toward consensus, especially under the weight of national expectation, can return in finer clothes. The illusion of unanimity can hide inside routinized process as easily as inside bravado. Rationalization of inconsistent data can emerge from brilliantly credentialed minds if their incentives are bent in the wrong direction. That is the quiet warning wrapped inside the Commission's dry chapters. A silent safety program does not mean no one cares. It means the people who care most do not have the venue, the ritual, and the protection to force the pause. When it is scariest to pause, we do not need to leave the 80s to see this dynamic at work. It lived in the way managers came to expect anomalies and then budgeted for them. It lived in performance reviews that prized schedule and calm. It lived in how success itself became an argument that marginal designs were actually sound. The Commission shone a light into those corners, and for a time the light made people squint and adjust. The agency wrote new rules. Contractors heard the message. The public watched for a time, then turned back to its daily life. The dangerous thing about a powerful lesson is not that people forget it. It is that they remember the parts that fit their day and soften the parts that trouble their day. The diagnosis, therefore, is both complete and incomplete. The Commission found a technical flaw and traced a cultural drift that let that flaw persist. It proposed engineering corrections and organizational reforms meant to restore independent safety authority and to reset the burden of proof near the margins. It gave language to a phenomenon that managers in many domains would later recognize in their own buildings, and it left a promise in the hands of people who had learned the hardest way, that an institution's habits can be fatal. The promise was simple to state, difficult to keep. We will not let one more abnormality pass without a deep look. We will not permit a chart to blur the rising curve. We will not ask for proof of danger when we should demand proof of safety. Outside the room, winter gave way, and engineers turned back to design and test with the familiar comfort of tangible work. Inside meeting rooms, long agendas began with new items. Safety sat closer to the head of the table. Voice loops were tracked. Anomalies were categorized with teeth. Managers practiced saying no in drills designed to feel like the night before a launch. In another place, a writer with a precise mind and a tired body finished a small, stubborn appendix and sent it to the printer. The diagnosis was on paper. The medicine was in motion. Whether it would stay in the bloodstream was still an open question, and history, patient as ice, was waiting to see if nature could be fooled again. 17 years after Challenger, the shuttle rose again into a sky full of confidence and habit. Columbia's final mission lifted off in early 2003 with experiments packed, crews smiling, and a history that had quietly shifted the baseline of risk. During ascent, a brief spray of foam broke free from the external tank's bipod ramp and struck the orbiter's left wing. The cameras caught it, the data recorded it, yet the program read it through the lens it had learned to trust. Foam had shed before, and nothing awful had happened. Requests for detailed on-orbit imagery were discussed, then softened, then set aside. The thing that mattered most was now the least urgent, because the story of foam had become a story of survival. The burden had quietly flipped. Prove to us that this is a problem, people thought. Not prove to us we are still safe. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board did what the Rogers Commission had done across a different decade. It named the physical cause, a breach in the reinforced carbon leading edge that allowed superheated plasma to cut deep during re-entry. Then it moved to the human system that let the breach arrive unchallenged. The board did not hide its language. It described a pattern of accepted anomalies, normalized deviations, and decision processes that muffled dissent in a program that still wanted to see itself as routine. It drew a straight line from the cultural findings after Challenger to the choices made by the mission management team. In that room, questions that should have been crisp turned elastic. Requests for imagery drifted toward budgets and jurisdiction, and safety voices arrived as suggestions rather than breaks. The echoes were not theoretical, they were operational. Foam shedding had become what managers called an in-family event, a phrase that sounds calm and technical but smuggles in a human bias. Over many flights, the tanks shed foam of different sizes and in different places. Engineers logged the events, wrote reports, proposed workdowns. Flights returned safely. As with the O-ring erosion that preceded Challenger, success piled up like evidence of safety, even though the underlying risk did not change. The board noted how previous strikes had been rationalized through rules that fit past luck. Tools such as the crater model were applied with assumptions tuned to thermal protection tiles rather than the harder leading edge, so outputs reassured when they should have alarmed. The decision-makers mistook clean numbers for clear knowledge. They took comfort from categories that had been drawn by their own prior judgments. Schedule and image pressures did not arrive as orders to launch at any cost. They arrived as the daily gravity of a prize program. The shuttle was meant to serve the space station, scientific partners, and public expectations. Each day a mission stayed aloft. The clock on supplies and crew fatigue ticked a little louder. Each request for extra imagery pulled on scarce assets and raised fears of a public discussion the team did not want. When normalcy has been hard-won, you guard it, and that guarding can look like restraint when it is actually inertia. The investigation showed how, inside that inertia, responsibility blurred, safety offices existed, but they could not compel the full court press that a clear unknown should trigger. Decisions accreted by default. If Challenger exposed how threshold standards can be diluted by past triumphs, Columbia showed how post-accident reforms can fade without constant defense. After Challenger, NASA rebuilt structures for independent safety and technical authority. Years passed, budgets tightened, managers rotated, and the program learned to fly again. The new norms, once enforced with zeal, softened under pressure. Independence wavered where program needs and safety judgments met. The board wrote of this drift with a specificity that made the pattern unmistakable. Improvements, if they are treated as a finish line instead of a daily practice, become historical artifacts, not living tools. So how do you keep a system from reg-learning forgetfulness? One answer begins with pattern recognition you can do with your own eyes and ears. Drift from original standards often announces itself in soft language. Terms like in-family, acceptable risk, and engineering judgment are not bad on their own, but they can become code, for we have gotten used to this. Ask what did not change. If the environment is the same, the hardware is the same, and only your tolerance has moved, you are watching normalization happen in real time. A second signal is the Burdenkopf-proof flip. In healthy danger, the default is hold until proven safe. In drift, the default becomes go unless proven unsafe. You hear it when teams argue that there is no evidence of harm rather than evidence of safety. The distinction sounds small, but it moves the entire posture of judgment. In the Columbia meetings, that posture sat like a weight on the table. People spoke in negatives, in the absence of data, in the tradition that if nothing bad had happened before, nothing bad would happen now. The board called this out as a core cultural failing, not an isolated oversight. A third is success-based justification. When a risky behavior keeps succeeding, it creates its own permission structure. The board connected this straight back to Challenger. Past success had been read as proof of acceptable risk. There is a difference between demonstration and luck. One is a test with margins explored and documented. The other is a string of survivals that feel like tests because they did not end badly. If you find your risk logic leaning hard on if it was dangerous we would have seen a problem by now, you are not analyzing. You are reassuring yourself. Preventing drift needs channels where dissent is not just allowed, it is expected. In a high-stakes operation, silence is expensive. That is why dissent must be paired with power. A hotline without authority is an outlet, not a control. A culture that says speak up but never says stop will, under pressure, drift toward quiet. The post-Columbia reforms recognized this and sought to harden safety's voice. Independence needs a charter, access to data, the right to ask naive questions, and the explicit right to pause operations. Words on paper help only if leadership treats a pause as a sign of strength. The paradox of speed is that stopping early preserves time. Evidence clarity is the next defense. The Columbia case turned on analysis tools and visuals that did not illuminate the true boundary of risk. Pictures and plots can soothe or sharpen. A good visualization makes margin visible. It forces you to see thresholds and tail risks instead of comforting averages. It shows what happens if your assumptions fail at the edge. In the foam analysis, models built on tile properties gave outputs that looked precise but were misapplied. The lesson is practical. Do not accept a chart that hides the cliff. Ask for the scale that hurts. Ask for the joint where a small change makes a big difference. Build reviews that demand people walk you to the boundary, not just the center line. If the display cannot show the edge, the decision cannot respect it. Guardrails at the level of governance make these habits durable. The board urged NASA to separate technical authority from program authority, to create a line that could say no without needing permission from the schedule. That model gave birth to a stronger engineering and safety presence, including a central body to test assumptions and cross-check logic across centers. But structure only works if it is kept fed with autonomy and attention. That means budgets that do not shrink first when programs tighten, leaders who treat uncomfortable truths as capital, and transparent accountability when standards are eroded. A safety office with veto power that is never used is probably not real. A program that never records a near miss is not safer. It is less honest. There is also the personal practice, the daily posture of people who make complex things fly. Engineers and managers can treat anomalies as gifts, not irritants. An anomaly is data that refuses to fit your story. When you find one, lock it in a place where it cannot be forgotten. In the run-up to Columbia's re-entry, teams debated whether damage would matter because survivals with scarred tiles seemed to suggest resilience. The hard question was not whether someone could show worst-case images. It was whether the team would treat uncertainty as an action signal. The humble stance is to say, we do not know, and because we do not know, we must see more, test harder, or stop. The reflex to protect momentum is human. The practice of protecting margin is learned. Drift is rarely announced by a dramatic speech. It arrives through calendar math and kind emails. It is leaders who stop asking impertinent questions in reviews. It is engineers who edit out outliers because they do not want to be the person who asks the room to turn around. Everyone involved in Challenger and Columbia carried pride, care, and ambition. The lesson is not that dedication fails. It is that dedication without friction slides. A well-run team builds ritual friction. Pre-briefs that pin down red lines. Post-a-flight reviews that publicize near misses with names and consequences. Cross-checks where outside experts can disagree in front of the room, on the record. Drills where pause authority is pulled for practice. So the muscle exists when it matters. These are not theater. They are guardrails against the pleasant pull of habit. You can feel the stakes because spaceflight makes them visible. Yet the pattern lives anywhere complexity grows and silence buys peace. Hospital that explains away near misses because outcomes were fine is writing the same story. A trading desk that points to months of gains while ignoring a growing concentration is doing its own burden golf-proof flip. An airline that treats stable readings as safety without checking the sensor is trusting the center of the chart. A software team that ships on time by skipping the only test that has ever broken them is reading success as proof of immunity. The drift does not care what you build, only that you like your rhythm. Only that you like your rhythm. If you want a litmus test, ask what would have to change after a bad day. If the answer is everything, your process is fragile. If the answer is, we would do what we already do, only louder, you are probably normalizing. The safer answer is concrete and pre-stated. If we see X, we stop. If we cannot measure Y, we pause. If a model leans on an assumption we cannot verify, we test the edge. If an engineer says they are not sure, we reward that admission with time and support. And then, importantly, we write down what we did and why. Because memory is a poor defense against human need. After Columbia, NASA made real changes. It rebuilt technical authority, created independent engineering checks, and invested in analyses that looked for tail risks. Flights returned with more humility. In the years that followed, foam shedding was attacked as a root problem, not a cosmetic nuisance. Managers were trained to listen for uncertainty rather than just for confidence. The fact that a second shuttle was not lost is not proof that the work is complete. It is proof that the vigilance can be practiced. The price of that practice is mundane and repetitive. Meetings that ask the same hard questions can feel inefficient until you remember what efficiency cost. None of this diminishes the loss or the bravery of those who carried the shuttle era forward. It clarifies the debt, which is to learn what the wreckage tried to say. The patterns are not mysterious once you know how to trace them. Normalization of deviance is not an exotic sociological label. It is the very ordinary process by which groups teach themselves to look away from outliers because the center of the story is comforting. The countermeasure is not heroics. It is a layered system, built on habits, structures, and people who accept that being slightly uncomfortable is a sign of health. The aim is not fear. It is alertness, sustained even when nothing seems wrong. Listen to the phrasing that helps. We will accept no drift from the standard without a documented hazard, tested mitigation, and independent review. We will show the boundary of failure, not only the middle of performance. We will make dissent public, and we will attach time to it. We will let safety stop the line, and we will thank it when it does. These are simple commitments that are hard to keep because they push against pride and pace. They can only live if leaders model them when it is easiest to ignore them. Every safe day is a good day to ask for the photo, insist on the test, and listen for the lone voice. The Challenger story showed how external pressure can be internalized until it feels like personal duty. The Columbia story showed how reforms that are not rehearsed slide back into accommodation. Put together, they explain a human truth. We do not stay safe because we are good. We stay safe because we build systems that anticipate our appetite for closure and success. We pick the safeguards that catch us when we reach for speed, or defend our image, or assume that the next flight will be like the last. We create a space where uncertainty is not a failing. It is information. If there is a last rule, it is this: treat every anomaly as a messenger from the future. If you read it well, you will change the future. If you file it away, the future will arrive on its own schedule. Columbia's broken path across the morning sky was not a sudden event. It was a long accumulation of small permissions. The board wrote it down so that we would not have to learn it again the same way. The mirror is still here, and we can decide what to do when it shows us our preferences. We can prefer the question over the answer, the margin over the myth, the pause over the push. Vigilance is a practice, not a memo. The cost of ignoring drift is paid all at once.